So what if the real secret to building a truly groundbreaking organization wasn't hiding in a spreadsheet, but in a simple, everyday greeting? Today, we're diving into the practical wisdom from the Fifth Discipline Fieldbook. Now, this is a guide for building organizations that don't just survive. They learn, they adapt, and they actually shape their own futures. And this isn't just theory, you know. These are ideas straight from the front lines of organizational change.
What's so interesting is where the Fieldbook decides to start. It's not with some complex business model or a new framework. Nope. It starts with a simple greeting from the tribes of Northern Natal in South Africa, Sawubona. And it literally means, I see you. But see, this isn't just hello. It's rooted in this incredibly profound philosophy of Ubuntu, the idea that a person is a person because of other people. Just think about that for a second. Our very existence, our identity, is confirmed and shaped by being seen and acknowledged by others. This one idea sets a deeply human foundation for everything that comes next.
Okay, so here's the game plan for this explainer. We're going to build on that human foundation. Then we'll dig into the urgent why, like why even do this work? We'll get a CEO's take on it, break down the 5 core disciplines, and then wrap up with the deep learning cycle that really brings it all to life.
So let's start right there, with that foundation. The entire idea of a learning organization, it really rests on this simple but profound ability to first be able to truly see one another.
And the response to Sawubona is just as powerful, Sikhwana, which means I am here. But notice the order there. It implies that until you see me, I don't fully exist. Your acknowledgement, your recognition, it literally brings me into being. This leads to a pretty powerful conclusion. Before we can create anything together, we first have to create each other through that mutual respect and recognition.
All right, so let's shift gears from the philosophical to the really pragmatic. The Fieldbook tackles the one question that every leader, every team member, is eventually going to ask.
Yeah? Why bother? Why go through all the effort? Why invest the time, the energy, the resources to try and build a learning organization? What is the actual payoff?
Well, the answers are pretty compelling. We're talking about achieving superior performance not by burning people out, but by linking their personal growth directly to the company's success. It's about building a competitive advantage that can actually last. It's about being able to handle constant change with confidence and creating a workforce that's genuinely energized and committed. But maybe, just maybe, the most important reason is to build an environment where people feel safe enough to tell the truth.
And this quote just nails the ultimate strategic reason. Ari DeGoose of Shell puts it perfectly. Your products, they can be copied. Your strategies, they can be replicated. But an organization's ability to learn faster than everybody else, that is an advantage that no one can ever take away from you.
So what does this look like from the CEO's chair? William O'Brien, the former CEO of Hanover Insurance, he gives us a really powerful perspective. He doesn't see this as some nice-to-have initiative. He frames it as a historical necessity, something you have to do to survive in this new era of work.
And this slide just lays it all out. The things that made companies successful in the last century, efficient manufacturing, breaking problems into tiny pieces, always having polite conversations, and top-down control, those things just aren't enough anymore. The future, O'Brien says, requires us to distribute power without creating chaos, to develop systemic thinking skills, to get really good at having difficult conversations, and for leadership to be based on voluntary followership, not mandated control. It's a whole new ballgame.
So, if that's the why, then what's the how? Well, the core of this work is built on 5 lifelong practices, which the book calls the learning disciplines.
And it's really important we get what discipline means here. This isn't a one-and-done training program. It's a path, a lifelong journey of learning. It's a set of techniques that you have to continually study and practice to get good at. And make no mistake, when you commit to them, they will fundamentally change how you see the world.
And here they are, these 5 disciplines. They all work together like a band. You've got personal mastery and mental models, which are really individual. Then you have shared vision and team learning, which are, all about the group. And the one holding it all together, the 5th discipline, is systems thinking, the one that helps us see the whole forest, not just the individual trees.
Now, when a team or an entire organization really commits to practicing these 5 disciplines, something incredible gets activated. It's not a straight line. It's more like a reinforcing cycle of deep learning and growth.
It all kicks off right here, with practice. As people start engaging with these disciplines, they build real, tangible new skills. They learn how to actually have the conversations that matter, how to clarify what they're truly aiming for,
and how to see the bigger picture. And suddenly, things that felt impossible start to feel, well, possible.
And these new skills, they lead to new awareness. You literally start to perceive the world differently. Instead of just blaming people when things go wrong, you start to see the underlying systems that are driving their behavior. You become aware of your own hidden assumptions instead of just thinking they're the truth.
And that new awareness is what leads to the most profound change of all, fundamental shifts of mind. Your core beliefs, both as an individual and as a group, actually begin to change. And this shift is what makes it possible to develop even deeper skills and capabilities, which, you guessed it, kicks the whole cycle off again, but this time at an even higher level.
And this brings us right back to where we started, from that simple, profound act of seeing one another all the way to this powerful learning cycle. It's all pushing toward one ultimate goal: creating a group of people who are continuously expanding their collective ability to create the future they truly want to see.
And so, that leaves us with a question to take back to our own work, to our own teams. When you think about all this, about having better conversations, uncovering assumptions, and learning together, what is the one conversation that your team really needs to be having right now, but for whatever reason just isn't?
Welcome to the Sleep Dives channel. In this explainer, we're jumping into pages 36 to 70 of our source material. And this is where we really shift gears, moving from the theory of learning organizations into the practical challenge of actually building one. We're going to tackle the biggest question of all: where on earth do you even start? So yeah, this is the big one, isn't it? The question that just keeps coming up. I mean, it's one thing to get your head around all the concepts and theories, but it's a completely different challenge to actually start the journey. So this part of our analysis is all about moving from those abstract ideas to the real, tangible architecture you need to create lasting change. All right, to really get our heads around this, let's use a metaphor, a really powerful one. I want you to imagine yourself as an architect. You're standing in a wide open field, but in your mind, you have this incredible vision for a new building. Now, you don't just start throwing bricks around, do you? Of course not. You need a blueprint, a plan, an architecture that's going to hold the entire thing together. And it's exactly the same for building a learning organization.
And that blueprint, that architecture, is built on 3 core pillars. Think of it like a triangle. On one side, you have your guiding ideas. On another, you have your theory, methods, and tools. And holding it all up, forming the base, are innovations in infrastructure. Each one is absolutely essential. If you try to build without one of them, the whole structure just comes tumbling down.
All right, so let's dig into pillar number 1, guiding ideas. You can think of this as the philosophical cornerstone of the whole project. This is the why behind everything else you're about to do. It's the foundation. So what exactly are guiding ideas? Well, they're basically the soul of the organization. And listen, we're not talking about some bland mission statement that a few execs cooked up over a weekend retreat. No way. We're talking about deeply held principles, the kind that only come from serious thought, deep study, and constant conversation. They spell out what the organization truly stands for and what its people are genuinely trying to create in the world. And this quote, man, it just hits the nail on the head. Bill O'Brien, the former CEO of Hanover Insurance, put it perfectly. He saw that so many companies are just polluted by bad ideas that reinforce themselves, Ideas like climb the corporate ladder no matter who you step on. The only way to fight that, he says, is to consciously cultivate powerful, positive, guiding ideas that are just better. Now, the source gives us 3 really profound examples of these guiding ideas, all coming from a systems thinking perspective. And each one, you'll notice, really pushes back against our usual Western way of thinking. First, the primacy of the whole. This idea that the world is already a web of relationships. We don't create them, we're just part of them. Second, the community nature of the self, which argues that we aren't isolated individuals. Our very identity is shaped by our connections to others. And third, the generative power of language, the mind-bending idea that the words we use don't just describe reality, they actually create it. Okay. So you've got your why, you have your philosophy, but that's just the start. How do you actually bring it to life? Well, that brings us to our second pillar: theory, methods, and tools. These are the practical engines that help people not just learn new skills, but more importantly, develop entirely new ways of thinking. Buckminster Fuller had this absolutely brilliant insight about this. You can't just order someone to think differently. It just doesn't work, does it? But If you give them a new tool, something tangible like a systems diagram or a reflective exercise, the very act of using that tool starts to rewire their brain. The tools are the gateway to new thinking. But, and this is a huge but, the tools are pretty much useless unless they are deeply connected to a solid theory. A tool without a theory might work once, maybe by pure luck, but you'll have no idea why it worked, you can't repeat it, you can't build on it, it doesn't transform anything. But when that same tool is backed by a clear theory, it builds real, repeatable knowledge and creates insights that stick. And that leads us right to the third and final piece of our architecture, innovations in infrastructure. This is all about creating the space, the social architecture, if you will, where learning can actually thrive as a natural part of the daily work, not as some special event. Now, when we say infrastructure, I want you to get the image of buildings and IT servers out of your head. That's not what we mean here. We're talking about the organizational structures, the day-to-day work processes, and how you allocate precious resources like people's time and money. It's about weaving learning into the very fabric of the business. So what does this actually look like in the real world? Well, let's look at a few examples. At Shell, they transformed their whole planning process. It stopped being about predicting the future and started being about helping managers learn and challenge their assumptions. At AT&T, the chairman knew they needed a different kind of conversation, so he created special forums for learning, totally separate from the usual decision-making meetings. And at the car company Saturn, they literally built a learning laboratory right next to the real assembly line so teams could experiment and solve problems on the fly. Okay, so we've got our three pillars: guiding ideas, theory and tools, and infrastructure. But here's the absolute key. You can't treat them like a checklist. They have to work together as a single integrated system. If you neglect any one of them, the whole effort is pretty much guaranteed to fail. And this table, it just lays it all out, plain and simple. Look what happens when one piece is missing. If you don't have those guiding ideas, there's no passion, no purpose. People just end up chasing the latest management fad. If you don't have theory and tools, nothing really changes. People talk about openness, but it's all superficial. And if you don't have the right infrastructure, all the good intentions in the world don't matter because there's no time, no space, and no resources. Learning just isn't taken seriously. You know, the whole quality circle movement back in the day is a perfect, almost tragic example of this in action. Companies introduced a new infrastructure, this new type of meeting, but they failed to provide the workers with the actual statistical tools they needed or to build a deep guiding philosophy around what quality really meant. And because the other two pillars were missing, the whole thing just fizzled out. So we've built this incredible external architecture, right? With these three strong pillars. But it makes you stop and ask, what's it all for? What is it all supposed to be supporting? Because the true foundation for all of this isn't a policy or program. It's something much, much closer to home. And this is where we get to the absolute heart of the matter. This quote really says it all. An organization isn't some machine you can tinker with. It's a living, breathing product of how the people inside it think and how they interact. That means the biggest lever for change isn't in rewriting the org chart or shifting budgets. The real leverage is in ourselves. Okay, so this idea of looking inward is great, but how do you do it? How can you actually tell if real, genuine learning is happening in your team or your company? Well, thankfully, the source gives us a really practical checklist you can use to find out. Let's go through these 4 questions together because they're an incredibly powerful way to diagnose what's going on. First, do we constantly test our experiences, even when everything is going great? It's easy to reflect after a failure, right? But a real learning culture questions its successes. Second, are we actually producing new knowledge? And by that we mean a real, tangible ability to act more effectively, not just collecting more data. Third, is that knowledge shared? Is it accessible? If a brilliant idea stays locked in one person's head, it's not organizational learning. And finally, number 4, is this learning actually relevant to our core purpose? Does it help us do what we're here to do? And this really brings us to the biggest trap, the most common mistake that organizations fall into time and time again. They get really excited about one piece of the puzzle. They'll buy a flashy new collaboration tool or announce a big restructure, but they do it in a vacuum, completely ignoring the need for a guiding philosophy or the right infrastructure to support it. That is a recipe for failure. Real, lasting progress only ever happens when you are patiently and intentionally developing all 3 pillars together in balance. So, to wrap this all up, what's the big takeaway? It's that building a learning organization means you have to think like an architect. You need a clear blueprint that brings together profound guiding ideas, powerful theories and tools, and a supportive infrastructure. But you have to remember that all of it, every single piece, is ultimately designed to spark a fundamental shift inside each of us. And that leaves us with one final, very personal question. The architecture gives you the how, but it can't give you the what. That part is up to us. So the real question you need to walk away with isn't just about the framework, it's about your own vision. What kind of organization are you helping to build? Welcome to the Sleep Dives channel. In this explainer, we're diving straight into pages 71 to 105. We'll be exploring the very heartbeat of how organizations learn, the kind of environment they need to really thrive, and those all-important first moves you can make to start a real transformation. You know, it's the big question, isn't it? Why do some organizations just seem to adapt and grow, while others get completely stuck in their ways? The secret, as we're about to see, isn't just about working harder or hiring smarter people. It's about learning better. And that all begins with understanding the fundamental engine that actually drives all learning, whether it's for just one person or a huge company. And that engine, well, you can picture it as a wheel. We're not talking about a one-off training day or a weekend seminar here. The wheel of learning is a really powerful model that helps us see learning as a continuous looping process, a kind of rhythm that the most effective teams have absolutely mastered. These stages flow in a really powerful sequence. It all starts with reflecting, just looking back on something you did and asking, what was I really thinking? What beliefs were driving me? Then you move to connecting, coming up with new ideas based on what you just reflected on. From there, you're deciding, picking a specific way forward. And finally, you get to doing, actually performing the task, but, and this is key, with an experimental mindset. Then you loop right back to reflecting on that new action. And here's the paradox. Teams that get this rhythm down actually learn faster, precisely because they appear to be moving more slowly and thoughtfully. And this shows so clearly how the whole cycle scales up. An individual's private reflection becomes a team's public reflection, where everyone's assumptions are out on the table. Connecting ideas becomes the creation of shared meaning, deciding turns into joint planning, and doing becomes coordinated action. So here's the crucial point. So many teams try to jump straight to planning and doing. They completely skip the two most important stages, public reflection and building shared meaning. And without those, the wheel just can't turn. But of course, a wheel can't just spin in a vacuum. It needs the right environment. For a learning organization, it's the leaders who create this space. They do it by cultivating what the source calls leadership fields. It's this unseen but very real pattern of influence that affects how everybody behaves. And building this field has almost nothing to do with that classic flashy charisma we think of. This quote is about a leader who was actually pretty quiet, almost mousy, yet he inspired incredible loyalty and excitement. Why? Because his power came from the clarity of his vision and his deep, deep attention to detail, both physical things like the layout of a room and emotional things. He created a field that drew people in, rather than just telling them what to do. Now, a key part of this field is intimacy. In a business context, this doesn't mean invading anyone's privacy. It's much simpler. It just means creating an environment that feels safe enough for honest information to flow. It's the willingness to say what you actually think about an idea, to admit you're not sure, or to even talk about your own failures. This kind of intimacy builds incredible trust, and it cuts out all that wasted energy spent on second-guessing and office politics. The other component is shared authority, and this is a really big shift in thinking. It moves us away from that traditional model where the boss has to carry the burden of every tough call all by themselves. Shared authority means the whole team is mutually responsible for the results. They become co-creators. This doesn't mean every single decision is made by committee, but it does mean that for the really critical decisions, you have to involve the people who are going to be affected and held accountable. So how do you actually start doing this? Well, this gives us a fantastic starting point. You can begin by sharing vital information that used to be kept private. Make a real deliberate effort to share the credit for the team's work. You can explicitly reward people for being open and honest even when it's uncomfortable. And maybe the most powerful one, actually hold discussions about the relationships themselves. Create the space to talk about how you all work together. So we've covered the what, that's the wheel of learning, and the where, the environment of intimacy and shared authority. So now we get to the how. Where on earth do you even begin this kind of journey? The key thing to remember is there's no single roadmap. The right entry point really depends on your current situation. If your organization is already pretty open, starting with a shared vision could work wonders. If you're in highly analytical, numbers-driven culture, maybe a deep system study is the best way in. If one particular team is just not working, maybe you start right there and focus on fixing the relationships. Or you could take a problem that just never seems to go away and use that as a lever to analyze the whole system. The strategy has to fit the context. So let's just pause on that for a moment. Think about your own team or your own organization. Its culture, its strengths, its nagging problems. Which of these doors feels like it's already a little bit open? Which path seems like the most natural place for you to begin? I mean it, really think about that, because the answer, that's your first move. Okay, theory is one thing, but putting it into practice is everything. So let's boil all of this down into a simple, actionable experiment you can start running for the next 30 days, just to see what starts to shift. Okay, here it is. First, just observe. In your team meetings, which stage of the learning wheel do you always seem to rush past? Is it the reflection bit, the connecting part? Just notice the pattern. Second, practice. In just one meeting, take a small risk. Share one honest opinion or feeling you'd normally keep to yourself. And third, find a partner. The stress of trying to create change can be huge. Find one trusted colleague to talk with. Now, the goal isn't to just dump your stress on them. That just shifts the problem. The goal is to process it together, to turn that raw frustration into focused, creative energy for change. So, to wrap it all up, we've really explored 3 foundational pillars here. First, you have to master the rhythm of learning, that constant cycle of reflection and action. Second, you have to cultivate the right environment, a space of intimacy and shared authority. And third, you need to look at your reality and make a conscious, strategic first move. And that brings us to our final question. Forget about transforming the whole organization for just a moment. Think about your team, right now. What is the one turn of the wheel, one moment of real reflection, one new connection, one brave decision that you need to make first? Because starting right there, that could change everything. Welcome to the Sleep Dives channel. Today, we're diving into pages 106 to 140 of our source material. This section really teaches us a completely new way of looking at the world. It's all about moving past that frustrating whack-a-mole game we play with daily problems and starting to see the invisible patterns and structures that are actually running the show. So, here's what we've got lined up. First, we're going to learn to speak the language of interconnection. Then, we'll get our heads around the paradoxes that make this language so powerful. We'll use a 4-level framework to see problems in a new light, learn how to tell a system story, and then, finally, we'll break it all down to its fundamental building blocks, links and loops. All right, let's start with this core idea. Systems thinking isn't just another business tool, it's basically a new language. Our normal way of speaking, subject, verb, object, it's fine for simple things, but it just completely falls apart in the real world, where A causes B, sure, but B is also influencing A, and both of them are tangled up with C and D. This new language is what gives us the grammar for all that complexity. And this new way of thinking is designed to answer this exact question. You know that feeling of being stuck on a treadmill where no matter what you try, the same issues just keep coming back? Well, that's a huge sign that there's a deeper structure at play, and systems thinking is all about how to untangle it. This quote from someone at Federal Express just nails it. They managed to massively improve their customer relations, not because of some top-down corporate mandate, but simply because their people started to think differently. It just goes to show you that the real leverage for change isn't always in new rules, but in changing the stories we tell ourselves and the way we see the world. So what exactly is a system? Well, it's not just a pile of parts. It's a web of interrelationships. The real structure of a company, for instance, isn't the org chart on the wall. No, it's the invisible web of attitudes, decisions, and feedback that makes all the individual people and departments act together as one single whole. Now, as we start using this new language, you've got to prepare for some seriously mind-bending paradoxes. The world of systems just doesn't work in the straightforward linear way we expect it to. In fact, sometimes the easiest answers are actually traps. And this leads to some really surprising rules. For instance, the cause of a problem might be months or even years in the past, and in a totally different part of the system. This is exactly why quick fixes backfire so often. They're just treating a symptom, not the root cause, which pretty much guarantees the problem will be back. It means we have to fight that urge for an easy answer and really embrace looking at the whole messy system to find where the real change can happen. So how do we actually do this? Well, let's walk through a really powerful framework for this, and we'll use the story of a company called Acme to see how it works. We're going to look at a problem through 4 different levels, moving from the obvious surface right down to the hitting root cause. These are the 4 levels. We start at events, which is really just reacting to what's right in front of our face. Then we zoom out a bit to see patterns over time. Deeper still, we start to map the systemic structure that's causing those patterns. And then, at the very core, we try to uncover the mental models, the beliefs and assumptions that hold the whole thing in place. Okay, so at the event level, Acme sees sales are down. So what do? They react. They push out more promotions, they put pressure on the sales team, they try to cut costs. They're treating the symptom, which is a bit like taking a painkiller for a broken leg. Sure, it might provide some temporary relief, but it does nothing to fix the underlying problem, and probably just makes things worse in the long run. Now moving to the second level, the managers start looking for patterns. They plot their sales and their service problems on a graph over time, and a story starts to take shape. This isn't just a bad quarter, it's a long-term trend. Sales have been slowly bleeding out for a while, just as service complaints have been steadily climbing. So they're seeing the what a lot more clearly now, but they still have no idea why it's happening. Level 3, this is the big aha moment. By mapping out the systemic structure, they finally see the vicious cycle they've created for themselves. Just follow the arrows here. Lower sales lead to intense pressure on the sales team. That pressure makes them overpromise to land new accounts. That, in turn, creates a huge spike in service problems. And guess what? Those problems drive away customers, which leads right back to lower sales. They've discovered that the harder they push, the worse things get. And finally, we get to the deepest level. Why does this loop keep going? Well, it's because of these unexamined mental models. Management believes that pressure is the best way to motivate people. The sales team believes their only job is to get new customers, no matter what it takes. And the service team feels like they're just there to clean up the mess. Until these core beliefs are actually brought out into the open and challenged, that system is never going to change. So, how can we start uncovering these hidden stories in our own work or even our own lives? Let's look at a really simple, but honestly, an incredibly powerful little technique for diagnosis. It's called the 5 whys. You just start with a symptom and you keep asking why over and over again, like a curious child. The real key here is to trace that chain of cause and effect backwards, pushing past the easy answers and the temptation to blame individuals, until you finally arrive at a systemic policy or structure that's the true source of the problem. Here's a great real-world example from Sears. So the symptom was that customer complaints were going through the roof. First, why? Well, it turns out mechanics were systematically overcharging people. Second, why? Because they were under intense pressure from really aggressive sales quotas. Third, why? Corporate had put these policies in place to slash costs and boost profits. And the final why? Because the entire company was under just immense financial pressure from new competitors. See that? In just a few steps, we've gone from a problem in the auto shop all the way up to a high-level strategic crisis. So now that we've seen how to find the stories, let's learn the grammar we need to actually draw them out. It's all about links and loops, which are the 2 fundamental building blocks of any system you can imagine. The first type is called a reinforcing loop. This is basically the engine of growth and collapse. Think of a snowball rolling downhill. A small action creates a result that encourages more of that same action, which then creates an even bigger result, and on it goes. It's a self-amplifying cycle. This graph really shows why these loops are so powerful and so deceptive. See, our brains are hardwired to expect linear growth, a nice, predictable, straight line. But reinforcing loops create exponential growth, just like compound interest. For a long, long time, it feels like nothing's really happening. And then, all of a sudden, the curve just shoots skyward. When it's working for you, we call that a virtuous spiral of incredible success. But of course, that snowball can roll in the wrong direction too. This diagram shows a classic vicious spiral. An overworked team leads to scattered focus, which leads to superficial quick-fix solutions. Those quick fixes mean problems aren't ever truly solved, so they just pile up, making the team even more overworked. It's a self-fueling disaster. Now, there's another key building block, the balancing loop, which we don't have time to fully explore here, but that's the force that seeks stability, like a thermostat. Most real-world systems are a mix of these 2.
Okay, so this is all very interesting, but how do we actually put it into practice? Here are a few key pointers for getting started, and, just as important, some common pitfalls to watch out for. The trick is to focus on problems that are chronic and keep coming back. That's the telltale sign of a deeper system at play. You have to resist that powerful urge to immediately jump to a solution. Your first job is just to understand what's going on. And maybe most importantly, you have to shift away from blame. Instead of asking who's messing this up, you need to start asking the much more powerful question, what is it about the system that's causing good people to get these bad results? Ultimately, this brings us right back to where we started. The structures that trap us in these frustrating cycles aren't usually external forces. They are the result of our own decisions, our own policies, and our own deeply held, often totally unexamined beliefs. The moment we change how we see the system, we gain the power to change the system itself. So I'll leave you with this to think about. Pick a stubborn challenge, something in your work or your life. Now, instead of asking, what should I do about this? Try asking a different question. What is the hidden loop? What's the invisible structure that is holding this problem perfectly in place? Seeing that structure, well, that's the first step to changing everything.
Welcome to the Sleep Dives channel. We're jumping into pages 211 to 245, and it's a fascinating journey, really. We're going to look at this strange paradox, how trying to master these huge, complex external systems, like a business, ultimately forces us to master the most complicated system of all, ourselves. It's all about how these tools of pure logic lead us right back to the art of personal growth.
So, let's kick things off with a question that I'm sure feels familiar to all of us. You do all the research, you make the perfect plan, and then the results are just not what you expected. Why does that happen? Well, it often comes down to the fact that the systems we live in today, in our work, our economy, even our lives, are just so complex they completely overwhelm our natural intuition. We literally can't juggle all the moving parts in our heads.
There's a name for this, actually. The economist Herbert Simon called it bounded rationality. And it's a simple truth, really. Our minds have limits. The mental maps we draw are often way too simple for the messy reality we're facing. And that's where something like computer simulations can be so powerful. But not as crystal balls, not for predicting the future. No, their real value is in letting us pressure test our own thinking, to see the hidden consequences of our beliefs play out in a totally safe space.
Okay, let's make this real. Let's see how this works in the real world with a brilliant case study. We're heading back to the late 1980s, where Martin Marietta Astronautics was facing a massive crisis on a huge government contract. It was a sink-or-swim moment that forced them to throw out the old rulebook and completely rethink their whole approach to production.
This right here, this was the number that started a revolution. They were projecting a cost overrun of $19 million on one contract. And under the new government rules, they couldn't just pass that cost on. They had to eat it. This wasn't just a little problem they could tweak. This was a full-blown crisis that meant they had to question absolutely everything.
So, the critical shift for them was in how they saw the problem. They moved away from a simple process map, just a straight line of tasks, A, then B, then C, to causal loop thinking. And this is a huge change. Instead of just seeing what happens next, they started to see how everything was influencing everything else. They started to finally see the hidden feedback loops that were secretly driving up their costs and causing all the delays.
And this new way of seeing things led to some really surprising, counterintuitive discoveries. One of their big goals was to dramatically speed everything up. Now, common sense would tell you, well, if you go faster, you're going to make more mistakes. But as John Parker, who is head of manufacturing, points out here, the complete opposite happened. Doubling their speed actually created this wonderful virtuous cycle, and it slashed defects by an unbelievable 75%. Why? Well, because things just didn't have time to sit around in queues getting lost, damaged, or obsolete.
So what was the result of all this new thinking? It's incredible. They didn't just avoid that $19 million loss, they finished the whole project with a $33 million surplus. That's a $52 million swing from where they started. It was such a massive success, it was actually read into the congressional record.
But here's where the story takes its most important turn. This amazing success created a brand new problem. How on earth could they do it again? They realized their victory wasn't just about drawing new diagrams or changing a process, it was about a whole new mindset. And you can't just hand someone a new mindset in a memo, right? They knew that for this change to actually stick, it had to go deeper. It had to become personal.
What they stumbled upon was a fundamental truth. Systems thinking isn't some standalone tool you just pull out of the box.
It's woven together with all these other disciplines, like having a shared vision or practicing team learning. But what they found was that no matter which discipline you start with, all roads eventually lead back to one, foundational discipline, personal mastery.
And this is really the core insight of this entire section. You can't truly change the system out there until you're willing to work on the system in here. The point where you have the most leverage, the place where you can make the biggest impact, it isn't a better spreadsheet or a new workflow, it's your own mindset, your own assumptions, your own vision.
So what even is personal mastery? Let's be really clear. This has nothing to do with domination or controlling things. A better way to think about it is like a master craftsperson. It's about getting to such a high level of skill that creating the results you truly want just becomes second nature. It's a way of living that feels less like a constant struggle and more like a creative flow.
Now, the engine that drives all of this is a force called creative tension. And the best way to get your head around it is to imagine a rubber band, okay? You're holding one end, and that represents your vision, what you truly, deeply want to create. The other end is anchored in your current reality, a totally honest, clear-eyed view of where you are right now. That gap between the two creates this natural, powerful tension that just wants to resolve itself, and it does that by constantly pulling your reality up towards your vision.
So the practice itself is beautifully simple, but it is incredibly powerful. It all comes down to these three fundamental steps. First, you're always clarifying and articulating what you really want, your personal vision. Second, you learn to see your current reality exactly as it is. No sugarcoating, no illusions. And third, you make the conscious choice to just hold that creative tension, to let it do its work without giving in to cynicism or despair.
This quote from Robert Fritz, who's a key thinker in this field, just nails it. The real power of having a vision isn't just about having a nice idea to daydream about. Its true power is in its ability to generate that creative tension. A really compelling vision creates the energy, it creates the pull that gets us moving and brings us forward.
All right, so this all sounds great in theory, but how do you actually do it? What does it look like to put this into practice, not just for yourself, but within a team or an organization? Let's get practical.
Trying to foster this in an organization, well, it's a delicate thing. It's called a high-voltage discipline for good reason. It absolutely requires a culture of deep trust, where it's safe for people to be honest about their vision and their reality. And that completely flips the role of a leader. You're no longer the director who has all the answers. You become a coach, helping people to see things for themselves. You move away from carrots and sticks and start trusting that people are driven by something much deeper, their own desire to create. So how can you start doing this today, right now? It's these three steps. First, clarify your vision. Ask yourself, what do I truly want to create? Second, assess your reality. Where am I right now? Be brutally honest with yourself. And third, and this is the hardest bit, you have to commit to holding both of those truths in your mind at the same time. The big temptation is to let that tension go, either by giving up on the vision, saying it's impossible, or by pretending reality is better than it is. You have to resist that. Learning to hold that creative tension, that is the work. That's where all the magic happens.
So, we've gone from the complex problems of a multi-million-dollar missile contract all the way to the very core of personal development. We've seen how the drive to understand and change these big external systems always circles back to the discipline of changing ourselves. The journey has to end with you. So I'll leave you with this to think about. What is the gap between your vision and your reality today? And are you willing to hold that tension?
Welcome to the Sleep Dives channel. Have you ever felt like you're stuck on a hamster wheel, just solving the same problem over and over and over again? Well, in this explainer, we're diving into pages 176 to 210, and we're going to learn how to get off that wheel. We're moving beyond those temporary fixes to start redesigning the very systems that cause the problems in the first place. And we'll even get a glimpse of how computer simulations can help us see the future. So here's the game plan. First, we're going to face a critical choice, a real fork in the road that decides if we succeed or fail. Then, we'll start digging to uncover the hidden side effects of all those quick fixes we love. After that, we get really practical, learning to redesign our reality with a 7-step plan to bust through gridlock. And finally, we'll level up, exploring how you can go from a back-of-the-napkin sketch to a full-blown simulation. You know, at the very heart of any problem, there's always this fork in the road. You can take the easy path, right? The quick fix that just papers over the symptom. Or you can take the harder path, the one that actually addresses the root cause. And honestly, this one choice, it determines everything. It determines whether you solve the problem for good or if you get trapped in a cycle you can't escape. To see what I mean, just look at the story of two villages in Togo. In one village, Amusakope, an Eid group just gave them a water pump. Seemed like a perfect quick fix, right? Well, it was, until it broke. They had no skills, no money, no one organized to fix it, so the gift became totally useless. Now contrast that with the village of Iole. There, the community was guided to build a whole system around the pump. They set up a management committee, they trained a mechanic, they even had a fund for repairs. See the difference? One was a temporary patch, the other built a permanent capability. This pattern has a name, and it is one of the most important ones to know. It's called shifting the burden. The first village, Amusokope, shifted the burden of their water security onto that gifted pump. It felt good, it was easy, but it sucked all the attention away from the real fundamental solution, which was building their own capacity. And over time, the ability to solve their own problem just withers away. And that's how you get a dangerous addiction to the quick fix. And trust me, this isn't just about villages. This happens everywhere in business. Take the Burson Benson Power Tool Company. They were getting hammered by defective products. Their quick fix? They created something they called a lathe hospital. Basically a fancy repair shop. But here's the crazy part. The better the hospital got at fixing things, the more the company relied on it. And all those resources, all that attention, got drained away from where it was really needed, fixing the manufacturing process itself. Okay, so recognizing this shifting the burden pattern is step one. Huge step. The next is to learn to see beyond the obvious fix. And we do that by asking one absolutely critical question. What are the unintended consequences? What else is this quick fix messing up somewhere else in the system? This is the question that changes everything. It's what turns you from being a victim of the system into a system sleuth. When your solution works for a bit, but then the problem roars back, maybe even worse than before, you have to stop and ask, wait a minute, what else did my fix touch? What new fires did it start? All right, let's put ourselves in a manager's shoes for a second. It's a classic scene. You're under intense pressure to cut the budget. So what are the obvious levers to pull? Well, you reduce headcount, you put off some of that non-essential maintenance, and you slash the marketing budget. On paper, it looks great. Costs go down immediately. Problem solved, right? Well, here's the nasty little secret. Cutting staff tanks morale and productivity. Deferring maintenance leads to massive, costly equipment failures down the road. And slashing marketing? Well, that shrinks your revenue. Every single one of those fixes creates its own vicious cycle, and eventually, they drive costs even higher than where you started. The solution literally becomes the engine of its own failure. Seeing those hidden loops, that's the breakthrough moment. It allows you to stop just reacting to symptoms and start actually redesigning the structure of the whole system. And that process always begins with the invisible driver of everything we do, our mental models. A mental model? It's really just the invisible story we tell ourselves to justify our actions. Think about that manager cutting costs. What was the story in their head? Probably something like, look, I'll just manage the consequences later. I have to hit my numbers now. It's only when we drag those hidden assumptions out into the light that we have any chance of changing the behavior they create. So how do we actually do this redesign? It comes down to two key moves. First, you have to weaken the addiction to the quick fix. There's a story of a lawn care company drowning in debt. The first thing they did was create a strict policy to stop borrowing money automatically. They broke that dangerous reflex. Second, you have to strengthen the fundamental solution. That same company created new, powerful incentives for aggressively cutting costs and actively finding new customers. You see? You starve the bad habit and you feed the healthy one. Now, we can take this kind of thinking and build it into a really practical step-by-step process for teams. Daniel Kim developed this powerful 7-step method to break through that organizational gridlock. You know that feeling where everyone is working really hard, but nothing is actually moving forward? The real genius of this framework is that it shifts the conversation away from blaming people and towards mapping the system that everyone is stuck in. You start by just agreeing on the problem symptom. Then each team maps out their own quick fixes. But here's the crucial part. They also map out the bad side effects those fixes have on other teams. Suddenly, all those hidden connections become visible, and the whole group can see the fundamental solutions that will actually help everyone. Okay, so everything we've talked about so far, the stories, the archetypes, it's all been qualitative. It's about understanding the shape and structure of the problem. But if you really want to test your assumptions and see how these systems play out over time, you need to go from the artist's sketch to the engineer's blueprint, computer modeling. John Sturman from MIT has this fantastic analogy for this. He calls archetypes training wheels. They are incredibly helpful for getting you started, for helping you get the feel of systems thinking. But computer models, those are the blueprints. They force you to be rigorous. They make you put numbers on your assumptions and actually test how the system is going to behave. To build a model, you have to get your head around stocks and flows. A stock is just an accumulation of something. Think of the water in a bathtub or the national debt. A flow is the rate of change. It's the water coming from the tap or the annual government deficit. So many people get this wrong. They think that cutting the deficit reduces the debt. It doesn't. It just means the debt, the stock, grows a little bit slower. You only reduce the debt when you run a surplus. And this is where the magic of simulation happens. You can map out a company's hiring process, and on paper it looks really simple. But once you add in real-world delays, time to hire, time to train, and you run the simulation, a totally hidden dynamic just pops out. You see the system will constantly overshoot its hiring target, then panic and lay off people, and undershoot it. It gets locked in this costly, painful cycle of hiring and firing that was completely invisible before. But it is important to have a little word of caution here. As John Sturman also says, the software doesn't do the thinking for you. A model is only as good as the assumptions you put into it. Without really rigorous, clear thinking, these powerful tools can just help you make bad decisions, but with a lot more confidence. So while computer modeling is an incredible tool for big organizations, these core ideas are also deeply personal. The real power here is applying this to the systems in our own lives. So let's try to find your own shifting the burden pattern right now. Just take a second and think about a problem that keeps coming back in your life. What is the quick fix you always reach for? Is it grabbing a painkiller for that bad back instead of actually doing the physical therapy? Is it just venting to a friend instead of having that one difficult conversation you know you need to have? Try to identify that quick fix, its hidden costs, and then be really honest. What's the fundamental solution that you're avoiding? All right, let's bring all of this together with a quick recap. We started this journey by facing that critical choice between a quick fix and a real solution. We learned how to spot the shifting the burden pattern, how to trace its hidden consequences, and how to expose the invisible mental models driving our behavior. But I think the most important takeaway is this. We are not just victims of these systems. We can actually be their architects. And that leaves us with one last question to think about. Every system, whether it's in your job, your family, or just inside your own head, is following an invisible script. Now that you have the tools to actually see that script, what are you going to do to rewrite it? Welcome to the Sleep Dives channel. In this explainer, covering pages 590 to 623, we're diving into a really fascinating question. How do massive companies survive constant change without losing their best people? We're going to explore how to build these incredibly stable corporate communities, how to use simulated micro-worlds for learning, and how to harness the surprising power of play to solve problems that data alone just can't touch. So here's what we're going to cover. We'll start with the foundation, the idea of a corporate community. Then we'll look at the tools for learning, these so-called practice fields. After that, we'll see it all come together in an amazing story about the power of play. And, of course, we'll wrap up with how you can actually apply these ideas. All right, let's jump into our first section, the corporate community. This is all about a central puzzle. How can a massive organization offer the stability people crave while also having the flexibility to adapt to a constantly changing market? Now, this was the exact challenge a company like AT&T was facing back in the 1990s. I mean, they were dealing with downsizing, they needed totally new skills, but they didn't want to just let go of their most valuable asset, their people. So what on earth did they do? Well, they came up with something absolutely brilliant called ResourceLink. Just think of it like an internal temp agency, but for their own full-time permanent employees. So when a project ended or a department had to shrink, instead of getting a pink slip, an employee could join ResourceLink and get leased out to other parts of AT&T that desperately needed their skills. And the benefits were just huge. I mean, for the individual, you get stability. For the company, you get incredible efficiency. But the real genius, the truly amazing part, was that it created what you could call a corporate neural network. As people moved between departments, they were spreading knowledge, building relationships, and breaking down those silos. This gave the leadership a real-time pulse on the entire organization, showing them which parts were thriving and which were struggling. And what AT&T's solution really shows us is that building a community isn't about some grand, abstract mission statement. No,